Tonight we are telling the whole thing, all of it. The wooden horse. The one-eyed giant who ate people for dinner and had genuinely terrible hospitality. A witch who turned men into pigs and then, somehow, became the most helpful person in the entire story. There is a bag of wind that someone really should not have opened. There are cannibals. There are ghosts. There is the most beautiful island in the world, and a goddess who offered a man eternal life, and the man said no because he missed his wife. We will meet a dog who waited 20 years. We will meet a wife who was cleverer than every man in the kingdom, which is saying something because they were not stupid men, just outmatched. And at the very end, there is a bed carved from a living olive tree, and why that mattered more than anything else in the entire story. It is a very long tale. That is rather the point. Get comfortable. If you enjoy these ancient stories told the way they were meant to be heard, go ahead and subscribe. We tell a new one every week. Now, to understand the Odyssey, you need to understand Troy. And to understand Troy, you need to understand something about the ancient Greeks, which is that they took hospitality extremely seriously. In most cultures, being rude to a guest was considered bad manners. In ancient Greece, it was a crime against the gods. Zeus himself was the protector of guests. So when a young Trojan prince named Paris visited the Greek king Menelaus, and Menelaus fed him and housed him and treated him like family, and Paris responded by running off with Menelaus's wife Helen, that was not merely a personal insult. It was an offense against the cosmic order. Menelaus, understandably, was not pleased. His brother Agamemnon, who was the most powerful king in Greece, and who had been looking for an excuse to attack Troy for some time, was even less pleased, but in a more strategic way. He called every Greek king and warrior to honor their oath, an oath they had all sworn years earlier when they were competing for Helen's hand, that whoever won her would have the support of all the others if anyone ever tried to take her, which, at the time, had seemed like a reasonable thing to agree to. And so 1,000 ships sailed for Troy, literally 1,000. The ancient Greeks were not people who did things by halves. Now, among those 1,000 ships was a small contingent from a rocky little island called Ithaca, led by a king named Odysseus. And Odysseus was, by all accounts, not the strongest warrior. He was not the fastest. He was not the tallest, or the most handsome, or the most nobly born. What Odysseus was clever. Dangerously, inconveniently, exhaustingly clever. The kind of clever that makes other people nervous, because you are never quite sure if he is solving your problem or creating a new one. He also, it should be said, did not want to go to Troy. He was newly married to a woman named Penelope, and they had a baby son named Telemachus, and Ithaca was small and peaceful, and the idea of sailing across the sea to fight someone else's war over someone else's wife held approximately zero appeal. In fact, when the recruiters arrived at his door, Odysseus pretended to be mad. He yoked a donkey and an ox together, which is a deliberately stupid thing to do, and began ploughing his fields in crooked lines, sowing salt instead of seed. It was a convincing performance. It almost worked. But one of the recruiters, a man named Phaeacians who was also rather clever, placed baby Telemachus directly in the path of the plough. And Odysseus, of course, swerved, because a truly mad man would not have noticed, and so his deception was revealed, and he had no choice but to sail for Troy. He never forgave Phaeacians for that, which tells you something about the man. The war lasted 10 years. 10 years of fighting and dying on the windy plains of Troy, far from home, for a cause that most of the soldiers had long since stopped caring about. The details of those 10 years are another story entirely, told in the Iliad, and they are full of glory and grief in roughly equal measure. Achilles fought and sulked and fought again. Hector defended his city with a dignity that makes you wish he had won. Ajax went mad. Patroclus died wearing borrowed armor, which is exactly the kind of thing that happens in Greek mythology, where even the most noble act has a terrible cost. But for our purposes, what matters is this. After 10 years of conventional warfare, it was Odysseus who ended it, not with strength, but with a trick. The wooden horse. Now, most people know the basic idea, but the details are worth lingering over, because they tell you everything about the kind of mind Odysseus had. The Greeks built an enormous hollow horse out of wood and left it on the beach as an apparent offering to the gods. Then they sailed their ships out of sight around a headland and waited. The Trojans, who had been fighting for a decade and were understandably tired, found the horse and debated what to do with it. Some wanted to burn it. Some wanted to push it off a cliff. A priest named Laestrygonians actually threw a spear at it and said, quite sensibly, that he did not trust Greeks bearing gifts, a phrase we still use 3,000 years later, which gives you some idea of how good the advice was. But the Trojans dragged the horse inside their walls anyway. There is something almost unbearably human about that, the desire to believe the war was over, to trust the beautiful thing on the beach, to choose hope over suspicion. They held a feast, they drank, they celebrated, and in the darkest part of the night, Odysseus and a small team of warriors climbed out of the belly of the horse, opened the gates, and let the Greek army in. Troy fell before dawn. It was brilliant, it was ruthless, and it set a pattern that would define the entire Odyssey, Odysseus solving impossible problems with his mind, and then discovering that cleverness always costs something. But before we move on, it is worth imagining the hours inside the horse, because those hours are almost never discussed, and they were perhaps the longest of Odysseus's life. The belly of the horse was dark and cramped, hot with the breath of 30 men pressed shoulder to shoulder, knees drawn up to chests, weapons digging into ribs. The air smelled of pitch and fresh-cut pine, and the sweat of men who were terrified. They could hear the Trojans outside, debating. They could hear Laocoon's spear strike the wooden flank and ring like a drum, and every man inside flinched. One of the warriors almost coughed. Odysseus put his hand over the man's mouth and held it there until the urge passed. They sat in that darkness for hours. The feast went on outside. They could hear singing and laughter and the clatter of cups, and they sat in silence, hardly breathing, waiting for the sounds to fade. This is the part of heroism that the songs rarely mention, the waiting. The long, cramped, breathless hours where nothing happens except doubt, and every man in that wooden belly was asking himself the same question. What if this does not work? Odysseus had asked himself that question many times. He had asked it while building the horse, while selecting the men, while climbing inside and hearing the hatch close above him. He had no guarantee. He had an idea, and the faith of 30 men who trusted him with their lives, and the patience to sit in the dark and wait. The sounds outside faded. The fires burned low. The city slept. And then Odysseus pushed open the hatch, and cold air rushed in, and the stars above Troy were bright and indifferent, and the most famous trick in human history moved from theory into practice. The morning after Troy fell, the city was burning. Smoke rose in great pillars into a sky the color of ash. The Greeks loaded their ships with treasure and captives, and the grim satisfaction of a war finally ended. And then they sailed for home. This is where most people think the story begins. In fact, this is where everything goes wrong. Because leaving Troy, the Greeks did something that angered the gods. The accounts differ on exactly what, but the core of it was arrogance. They had won, and winning made them careless. Some say Ajax the Lesser assaulted the priestess Cassandra in Athene's own temple. Some say the Greeks failed to make proper offerings before departure. Whatever the specific offense, the gods were watching, and the gods were not amused. Athene, who had actually helped the Greeks during the war, turned against them. She asked Poseidon to scatter their fleet with storms. And Poseidon, who rarely needed an excuse to make sailors miserable, was more than happy to oblige. The fleet broke apart. Ships were driven to every corner of the Mediterranean. Many never made it home at all. And Odysseus, who had been so clever at Troy, found himself at the mercy of the one force that no amount of cleverness can outwit, the sea itself. His first stop was a place called Ismaros, home of the Cicones. Now the Cicones had been allies of Troy, and Odysseus's men, still in warrior mode, attacked their city, killed the men, and divided the spoils. Odysseus told his crew to take what they needed and leave quickly. This was, objectively, good advice. His crew ignored him. This will become a recurring theme. In fact, if you wanted to summarize the entire Odyssey in a single sentence, it might be this: Odysseus kept telling people not to do things, and they kept doing them anyway. The men stayed to feast on the beach, slaughtering cattle and drinking wine, and by morning the Cicones had gathered reinforcements from the mainland. The counterattack was fierce. Odysseus lost 6 men from each of his 12 ships, 72 good sailors dead because nobody wanted to stop eating. They fled back to the ships with the Cicones at their heels and sailed out into a storm that Poseidon had whipped up, a gale that drove them south for 2 days without sight of land. When the storm finally broke, they found themselves approaching the land of the Lotus Eaters. This is one of the briefest episodes in the Odyssey, but in some ways it is the most unsettling. The Lotus Eaters were not hostile. They did not attack. They simply offered Odysseus's scouting party the fruit of the lotus flower to eat, and the men who ate it forgot everything. They forgot Troy. They forgot Ithaca. They forgot their wives and children. They forgot that they wanted to go home. They sat in the warm sun, perfectly content, with no desire to do anything ever again. Think about that for a moment. After 10 years of war and weeks of brutal sailing, someone offers you a fruit that takes away all the pain, all the longing, all the grief. You would not need to worry about the sea anymore. You would not need to miss anyone. You would simply be at peace. Odysseus had to drag his men back to the ships by force, weeping and struggling the whole way, and lash them to the rowing benches until the effect wore off. It is one of the few times in the story where Odysseus had to physically overpower his own crew, and the reason it was necessary is that the Lotus Eaters were offering something genuinely tempting, the chance to stop caring. Every culture has a version of this story. The Chinese tale of the peach blossom spring, where a fisherman discovers a hidden valley of perfect contentment and can never find it again. The Celtic stories of the Otherworld, where time moves differently and a visitor returns to find 100 years have passed. Something in the human imagination keeps returning to the idea that peace might be a trap, that the price of comfort is forgetting who you are. Odysseus chose to remember. He always chose to remember, even when it hurt. And here is something worth knowing about the lotus, because the Greeks were precise about their poisons. The flower did not cause hallucinations. It did not produce visions or revelations or ecstasy. What it produced was the absence of wanting. The men who ate it did not gain anything. They simply lost the ability to miss what they had left behind. And there is a difference, a crucial difference, between being at peace and being unable to care. One is a state of grace. The other is a kind of death while you are still breathing. Odysseus understood this. Perhaps instinctively, perhaps because he had already lost enough to know that grief, terrible as it is proof that you once loved something. Take away the grief and you take away the love with it. He would rather hurt than forget. The ship sailed on. The men who had been dragged back from the Lotus wept for a while, and then, gradually, the sea air and the salt spray and the rhythm of the oars brought them back to themselves. The wanting returned. The ache for home returned. And that ache, that persistent, nagging, exhausting ache, was the thing that kept them alive, especially when it hurt. And so they sailed on, past the place where forgetting was possible, and toward an island where a one-eyed giant was about to make the whole journey infinitely worse. The island was beautiful, lush and green, with wild goats grazing on hillsides and a natural harbor where the ships could shelter from the wind. Across a narrow channel, they could see a larger island where smoke rose from what looked like a settlement. Odysseus, being Odysseus, had to investigate. He took one ship and 12 of his best men, along with a skin of particularly strong wine, which was a gift from a priest of Apollo. The wine was so potent that you were supposed to mix it with 20 parts water. Odysseus brought it undiluted. He did not yet know why, but something told him it might be useful. This is the kind of man Odysseus was, the kind who brings extremely strong wine to an unknown island on the off chance that something might go terribly wrong. They found a cave, an enormous cave, the entrance as wide as a barn door, and inside the air was thick with the smell of sheep dung and damp stone. There were pens of lambs and kids separated by age, which suggested a careful farmer. There were baskets of cheese, beautiful white rounds of it, and pails of whey. The men wanted to grab the cheese and leave. Odysseus said no. He wanted to meet the owner and receive a guest gift because, remember, hospitality was sacred. This was, in hindsight, a mistake. The owner was Polyphemus, a Cyclops, a son of Poseidon. He stood as tall as a ship's mast, and his single eye sat in the middle of his forehead like a lamp. When he came home that evening, herding his flock of sheep, each one the size of a small horse, he rolled a boulder across the entrance that 20 wagons could not have moved. And then he noticed the Greeks. "Strangers," he said, "who are you? Where do you come from?" Odysseus, ever careful, explained that they were sailors blown off course, and he asked the Cyclops to respect the laws of hospitality, as Zeus demanded. Polyphemus laughed. The Cyclopes, he said, did not care about Zeus. They were older than the Olympian gods, stronger, and they answered to no one. Then he grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men, one in each hand, and dashed their brains out against the cave floor like a man cracking walnuts. He ate them, bones and all, and washed them down with milk. Then he went to sleep. Now the obvious impulse is to kill the monster in his sleep. But this is exactly the kind of problem that separates Odysseus from every other hero in Greek mythology. Achilles would have attacked. Heracles would have attacked. Ajax would have attacked. Odysseus looked at the boulder blocking the exit and realized that if he killed the Cyclops, they would all die anyway, sealed inside the cave with no one strong enough to move the stone. The only way out was through the giant, alive. So he waited, The next morning, Polyphemus ate 2 more men for breakfast, then left with his flock, carefully rolling the boulder closed behind him. Odysseus spent the day planning. He found the Cyclops' club, a great trunk of olive wood, and he and his men sharpened one end into a point and hardened it in the embers of the fire. Then they waited. When Polyphemus returned that evening and ate 2 more men for supper, which tells you something about the giant's commitment to routine, Odysseus approached him with the skin of strong wine. "Here," he said, "try this." The Cyclops drank it neat, all of it, and it was unlike anything he had ever tasted. He asked Odysseus his name. "My name is Nobody," Odysseus said. The giant grunted. "Then I will eat Nobody last. That is my guest gift to you." Which is, as guest gifts go, somewhat underwhelming, but never mind. When the wine had done its work, when the giant lay snoring in a stupor, his single eye half-lidded and glazed, Odysseus and his 4 strongest men lifted the sharpened stake, heated its point in the fire until it glowed, and drove it into the Cyclops' eye. The sound was like a blacksmith plunging a red-hot axe into cold water, a hissing, sizzling scream that Homer describes with the precision of someone who had spent time in a smithy. Polyphemus roared. He pulled the stake from his eye and flung it aside. He screamed for help. The other Cyclopes came running through the night to his cave. "What is wrong, Polyphemus?" they called. "Who is hurting you?" "Nobody is hurting me," Polyphemus bellowed. The other Cyclopes paused. "Well," they said in essence, "if nobody is hurting you, then there is nothing we can do. Perhaps pray to your father Poseidon." And they went home. Let that settle for a moment. It is perhaps the most elegant trick in all of mythology. The wordplay, the patience, the understanding that a name could be a weapon. Nearly every culture has its own version of this story, from the Norse tales of Thor at Utgard-Loki to the West African stories of Anansi, the spider, the clever small creature who defeats the giant through language rather than strength. Something in the human imagination loves the idea that wit can overcome power. Perhaps because most of us feel, at one time or another, very small in a very large world. The next morning, Polyphemus, blind and raging, sat at the entrance and felt the back of each sheep as it filed out to graze, checking for Greeks clinging to the wool. But Odysseus had lashed his men to the undersides of the sheep, 3 sheep per man, with the man hanging beneath the middle animal. He himself clung to the belly of the largest ram, fingers wound tight into the thick, oily wool. The ram was the last to leave, because it was weighed down. Polyphemus even spoke to it, stroking its back. "Poor old friend," the giant said. "You are usually the first out of the cave. Is it grief for your master's eye that slows you?" There is something almost tender about that moment. The blinded monster, speaking gently to his favorite sheep, while the man who blinded him hangs inches below his hand. And then, of course, Odysseus ruined everything. As his ship pulled away from the island, safely out of reach, or so he thought, Odysseus stood at the stern and shouted back across the water. He could not help himself. He had pulled off the most brilliant escape in human storytelling, and nobody knew it was him. "Cyclops," he yelled. "If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." His crew begged him to stop, but the name was already traveling across the water, and Polyphemus heard it. The blind giant stood on the cliff, blood still running from his ruined eye, and he raised his hands to the sky and prayed to his father Poseidon. "Hear me, Earthshaker," he said. "Grant that Odysseus of Ithaca may never reach his home. But if it is fated that he must, let him arrive late and in misery, all his companions lost, in a stranger's ship, and let him find trouble in his house." Poseidon heard that prayer, and he granted every single word of it. It is worth pausing here, because this is the hinge on which the entire story turns. Every disaster that follows, every shipwreck, every death, every year of wandering, traces back to this one moment of pride. Odysseus was brilliant enough to call himself nobody, and foolish enough to shout his real name. The Greeks had a word for this kind of excess, hubris, and they believed the gods punished it without exception. The very quality that made Odysseus heroic, his fierce need to be known, to be recognized, to matter, was the same quality that destroyed him. And perhaps that is the most honest thing about this story. The hero's greatest strength and his greatest weakness were the same thing, wearing different faces. From the Cyclops' island, Odysseus sailed with a heavier heart and a lighter crew. 6 men gone in that cave, eaten like snacks. But he still had 11 ships and the stubbornness to keep going, and the sea, for the moment, was calm enough to breathe. They came next to the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Now, Aeolus was a curious figure. He lived on an island surrounded by a wall of unbreakable bronze, and inside that wall he kept all the winds of the world like pets, letting them out when Zeus requested and reeling them back in when they misbehaved. He had 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, and he had married them to each other, which the ancient Greeks apparently found less strange than we do. Different times. Aeolus was a generous host. He feasted Odysseus for an entire month, listening to stories of Troy, which were still fresh enough to be exciting, and when the time came to leave, he gave Odysseus a gift, a leather bag, stitched tightly closed and bound with a silver cord, containing every unfavorable wind. Only Zephyrus, the gentle west wind, was left free, and Aeolus set it blowing in exactly the right direction to carry Odysseus home. It was, genuinely, the kindest thing anyone had done for Odysseus on the entire journey. For 9 days, Odysseus sailed west with a fair wind, barely sleeping, keeping one hand on the tiller at all times, because by now he had learned the hard way that the moment you stopped paying attention, everything fell apart. And on the 10th day, Ithaca appeared on the horizon, his home. He could see the mountains. He could see the smoke from hearth fires rising into the morning air. He was close enough, some accounts say, to see people moving on the shore. And then, after 9 days of not sleeping, Odysseus fell asleep. It is almost funny. After everything, the Cyclops, the storm, the dead men, the long nights at the tiller, what undid him was simple human exhaustion. His body just gave up, and you cannot really blame him. 9 days without sleep is a very long time, even for the cleverest man in Greece. And what a cruel thing sleep is when you think about it. The one human need that cannot be resisted, the one force that defeats every will and every plan. You can fight hunger. You can fight thirst. You can fight pain and cold and despair. But sleep comes for everyone eventually, and it does not negotiate. Odysseus, who had talked his way past a Cyclops and held his men together through storms and starvation and grief, could not talk his way past the simple biological fact that a human body will shut itself down when it has had enough. He must have fought it. He must have felt his eyelids growing heavy and pinched himself, or splashed his face with seawater, or recited the names of his crew to stay alert. He was within sight of home. He could see the smoke from the hearth fires. Everything he had suffered for, everything he had lost, was about to be worth it, and his body chose that moment to betray him. There is a lesson in that, though it is not a comfortable one. Sometimes the thing that defeats you is not the monster or the curse or the malice of the gods. Sometimes it is just being human. Sometimes you are simply tired. His crew had been watching the leather bag with increasing curiosity. Aeolus had given it to Odysseus privately, and Odysseus had not explained what was inside. The men, quite reasonably, assumed it was treasure. Gold, silver, jewels, the kind of thing a wealthy king might give to a favored guest. And here was Odysseus, who already had the lion's share of the Trojan spoils, keeping yet another fortune all to himself while they did the rowing. So they opened it. All the winds burst free at once. Every gale, every tempest, every howling squall that Aeolus had trapped in that bag came roaring out in a single catastrophic moment, and blew the entire fleet all the way back across the Aegean Sea, all the way back to Aeolus's island, undoing 10 days of perfect sailing, in what must have been one of the most spectacular navigational disasters in the history of human travel. When Odysseus woke up and realized what had happened, Homer tells us, he considered throwing himself into the sea and drowning. He decided against it, but the fact that he considered it tells you the depth of his despair. They limped back to Aeolus and asked for help again. Aeolus took one look at them and said no. "You are cursed by the gods," he said. "Get out. I cannot help a man whom the gods despise." And he shut the door. Which, to be fair to Aeolus, was probably the correct assessment. And so they rowed on, without any favourable wind at all, through flat, calm seas where the oars were their only engine, until after 6 days they came to a place that seemed at first like salvation, a natural harbour, deep and sheltered, with towering cliffs on all sides and a narrow entrance. It was the most beautiful anchorage they had seen in months. 11 of the 12 ships sailed inside. Only Odysseus, cautious as ever, moored his own ship outside the harbour, tied to a rock near the entrance. This saved his life. Because the harbour belonged to the Laestrygonians, and the Laestrygonians were cannibals. They were giants, not as large as Polyphemus, but large enough, and their queen was described as being as tall as a mountain peak, which is the kind of poetic exaggeration that nevertheless communicates the general idea. When the scouts Odysseus sent ahead met the queen, she immediately summoned her husband, who grabbed one of the scouts and ate him on the spot. The others ran. The Laestrygonians swarmed to the cliffs above the harbour and began hurling boulders down onto the trapped ships. Enormous rocks, each one crushing a hull like a foot crushing an egg. The narrow entrance that had seemed so sheltering was now a trap. The men in the water were speared like fish. Odysseus cut his mooring rope and rowed for the open sea, shouting for his crew to pull harder than they had ever pulled in their lives. His was the only ship to escape. 11 ships, hundreds of men, gone. Let that settle for a moment. In a single afternoon, Odysseus went from commanding a fleet of 12 ships to captaining one. Every face he had known since leaving Troy, the men who had hidden inside the wooden horse with him, the men who had fought beside him for a decade, most of them were now dead. And he sailed on, because what else could he do? The sea was quieter now, but only because there was less to protect. With one ship and a crew of perhaps 40 men, Odysseus reached the island of Aea, home of Circe. The island was heavily forested with ancient oaks, and from somewhere deep among the trees came the sound of singing, a woman's voice, clear and strange, weaving together with the rhythm of a loom. Smoke rose from a stone house in a clearing, and around the house, padding softly through the undergrowth, were wolves and mountain lions. But the animals were not threatening. They wagged their tails. They nuzzled the men's hands. They had the eyes of people. They were people, or they had been before Circe got to them. Odysseus sent a scouting party of 22 men, led by his lieutenant Eurylochus. They found Circe in her hall, beautiful and terrible, her hair dark as midnight, her robes shimmering like silk, and she invited them in for a meal. She mixed cheese and barley and honey with Pramnian wine, and she stirred into it a drug that made them forget their homeland. Then she struck them with her wand, and one by one they transformed. Pig ears, pig snouts, pig bristles. Their bodies changed, but their minds stayed human, which is arguably the cruelest part. They could still think. They could still remember. They just could not speak or stand upright or do anything about it. Eurylochus, who had been suspicious enough to stay outside and watch through a window, ran back to the ship in a panic. "They are all pigs," he reported, which must have been a difficult sentence to say with a straight face, even under the circumstances. Now, what happens next reveals something important about Odysseus. A lesser man, having just lost 11 ships to cannibals, might have decided that rescuing his men from a witch was not worth the risk. But Odysseus drew his sword and walked into the forest alone. On the way, he met the god Hermes, who appeared as a young man with a casual air, as though bumping into a desperate sailor in a magical forest were the most ordinary thing in the world. Hermes was, of all the Olympian gods, the one you would most want to meet in a crisis, because he was practical, quick-witted, and fundamentally fond of mortals, in the way that a person might be fond of particularly interesting pets. Hermes gave Odysseus a plant called moly, a black-rooted flower with a milk-white blossom that would protect him from Circe's magic. "When she strikes you with her wand and nothing happens," Hermes said, "rush at her with your sword drawn. She will invite you to her bed. Accept, but first make her swear an oath on the river Styx that she will not try any more tricks." Which is, as divine advice goes, surprisingly specific. Odysseus followed the instructions exactly. Circe's potion had no effect on him. When she struck him with her wand, he did not change. He drew his sword. She fell to her knees. "You must be Odysseus," she said, because apparently his reputation for being impossible to trick had reached even the remote magical islands. She swore the oath, restored his men, and then, in one of the more unexpected turns in the story, became genuinely helpful. In fact, Odysseus stayed on Circe's island for an entire year. This tends to surprise people because it seems wildly off character for a man desperate to get home. But consider what he had been through. 10 years of war, a blinded giant, a betrayal of wind, the loss of 11 ships and hundreds of men. He was exhausted, and Circe's island was safe, and sometimes even the most driven person needs to stop. The ancient Greeks understood this. They did not judge Odysseus for the year on Aea. Rest is not the same as giving up. Rest is what lets you continue. And Circe's island was a good place to rest. The food was excellent, the wine was plentiful, and for the first time since Troy, nobody was trying to eat the crew. The men healed. They mended their clothes and their nerves. They told stories at night around fires that smelled of cypress and rosemary. And slowly, the tension went out of their shoulders, and the haunted look faded from their eyes. Circe herself turned out to be remarkable company. She was the daughter of Helios, the sun god, and the ocean nymph Perse, which meant she had been alive for a very long time and had accumulated the kind of knowledge that only comes from watching centuries pass. She knew the names of every plant on the island and what each one could do. She knew the migration patterns of birds and the habits of sea creatures, and the locations of every underwater rock between Aeolus and the edge of the world. She was, in her way, as clever as Odysseus, and it is possible that the reason they got along so well is that they recognized in each other the same restless intelligence, the same inability to leave a question unanswered. The year passed with a gentleness that Odysseus had almost forgotten was possible. Seasons turned. The olives ripened and were pressed. Rain came and went. And somewhere in that quiet year, Odysseus began to remember what it felt like to be a person rather than a survivor. But eventually his men came to him and said, gently, "It is time to remember home." And Odysseus agreed. He asked Circe how to reach Ithaca, and she told him something that no living man wants to hear. "You cannot go home yet. First, you must visit the house of the dead." There is a long pause in the story here, a moment where Homer lets the weight of that instruction settle over Odysseus. Of all the impossible things he had been asked to do, this was the most impossible of all. Living mortals did not go to the underworld. That was the one rule that even heroes did not break. But Odysseus was not being given a choice. Circe told him to sail to the edge of the world, to the place where the river ocean flows, and there he would find a dark shore and a grove of poplars and willows sacred to Persephone. He was to dig a trench, pour offerings of milk and honey and sweet wine and water, sprinkle white barley over it all, and then sacrifice a black ram and a black ewe, letting the dark blood flow into the trench. The ghosts would come. They always came for blood. And so Odysseus sailed into the grey waters beyond the known world, past the lands of the Cimmerians where the sun never shines, where perpetual mist and cloud hang over a people who live in a kind of eternal dusk. The air grew cold. The light faded to the color of old ash, and they reached the shore. Odysseus did as Circe instructed. He dug the trench. He poured the offerings. He killed the animals and let the blood pool in the dark earth. And then he sat, sword drawn, and waited. The ghosts came. They came as pale shapes, drifting out of the mist like memories half forgotten. Young men who had died in battle, old women worn out by grief, brides still in their wedding gowns, warriors still carrying the wounds that killed them. They crowded around the trench, drawn by the smell of blood, reaching toward it with translucent hands, making a sound that Homer describes as a kind of thin, high wailing, like bats disturbed in a deep cave. Odysseus held them back with his sword, because the ghosts could only speak clearly if they drank the blood, and he needed to find Tiresias first. The blind prophet came. He had been blind in life, and he was blind in death. But his mind was the one thing that Persephone had allowed to remain sharp among all the shades. He drank the blood, and his voice became clear, and he told Odysseus what lay ahead. "Do not touch the cattle of the sun god on the island of Thrinacia," he said. "If your men harm those sacred animals, your ship will be destroyed and your crew will perish, and you will come home alone and late in the ship of strangers to find your house full of arrogant men consuming your wealth and courting your wife." Every word of that prophecy came true. But it was not Tiresias who broke Odysseus's heart. It was his mother. He had not known she was dead. She had been alive when he left for Troy 20 years ago, a healthy woman in a comfortable home. But the shade of Anticlea, his mother, drifted toward the trench, and when she drank the blood and saw him, she wept. She told him she had died of grief, waiting for him to come home. The longing, she said, had taken everything from her, bit by bit, until there was nothing left. Odysseus tried to embrace her. He reached out with both arms, the way you reach for someone you love who you have not seen in a very long time, and she slipped through his hands like a shadow or a dream. He tried again. The same. A third time. Nothing. "Mother," he said, "why do you pull away from me? Let me hold you, even here, even in the land of death. Let us throw our arms around each other and find some comfort in our grief." And Anticlea said, "My child, this is the way of mortals when we die. The sinews no longer hold the flesh and bones together. The fire consumes the body. The spirit flies away like a dream." That image, a son reaching for his mother's ghost and finding only empty air, has been echoing through literature for nearly 3,000 years. Virgil borrowed it for the Aeneid. Dante borrowed it for the Inferno. It appears in Japanese no theater and in the ghost stories of a dozen cultures. This simple, devastating idea that the dead are close enough to see, but can never be touched again. It is one of the quietest moments in the Odyssey, and one of the most powerful. There are no monsters in this scene, no tricks, no cleverness, just a son and his mother's shade, and the impossibility of bridging the gap between the living and the dead. Let that settle for a while. There is no rush. Odysseus spoke to other shades too. He met Achilles, the greatest warrior of Troy, and Achilles said something remarkable. He said he would rather be a living farmhand, a serf working for a poor man with no land, than king of all the dead. This from the man who had chosen glory over long life, who had known his fate and gone to Troy anyway. Death, it seems, changes your priorities. He met Ajax, who had gone mad after losing the contest for Achilles' armor. Ajax would not speak to him. He simply turned away and walked back into the darkness, still carrying his anger into eternity. And Odysseus, for once, did not try to be clever. He simply stood and watched the ghost of a man he had wronged walk away, and felt the weight of it, He saw Tantalus, standing in a pool of water that receded every time he bent to drink, beneath fruit trees whose branches lifted out of reach, every time he raised his hands. He saw Sisyphus, pushing his boulder up the hill, feeling it roll back, pushing it up again. These images have become so embedded in our language that we forget they were first told here, in this grey underworld, by a living man who should not have been there and who knew he could not stay. Eventually, the shades began pressing closer, too many of them, crowding in from every direction, and Odysseus grew afraid. Not of any single ghost, but of the sheer weight of the dead, the endless, silent multitude who had once been alive and who now were this. He retreated to his ship, and his men rowed him back to the world of the living, back toward the light. There is something important about the underworld that Homer wants us to understand, and it is this. The dead do not suffer exactly. They do not feel pain, but they do not feel joy either. They exist in a state of diminished being, aware of who they were, but unable to be it anymore. Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, would trade all the honor of the dead for one more day of sunlight. His mother, who loved Odysseus more than anything in the world, could not hold her own son. The underworld was not a place of punishment for most. It was a place of reduction. Everything that made you vivid, your warmth, your weight, your voice, your ability to touch and be touched, was taken away. And what remained was only the shape of who you had been, moving through grey air, remembering. This is why the blood in the trench mattered so much. Blood was life. Blood was warmth. For the brief moments when the shades drank, they became almost real again, almost themselves, and the cruelty of it was that the effect faded, and they sank back into that grey halfness, having been reminded of everything they had lost. Odysseus left the underworld with a deeper understanding of what it meant to be alive. Every breath was a gift. Every sensation, even pain, even grief, was proof that he was still on the living side of that divide. The cold air on his face, as the ship pulled away from the dark shore, felt sharper than it ever had before. The creak of the rigging sounded sweeter. The stars, when they finally appeared, burned brighter against the black sky. He had been to the place where brightness ends, and he was sailing back toward the light. He returned to Circe's island briefly, because she had more warnings to give. And what she described next was perhaps the strangest test Odysseus would face, because it was a test not of strength or cleverness, but of desire. The Sirens. Now, you have probably heard of the Sirens, and you probably imagine beautiful women sitting on rocks. But Homer never describes what they looked like. He does not mention beauty at all. What he describes is their song, and their song was not about desire. It was about knowledge. The Sirens told Odysseus they knew everything that happened at Troy, and everything that would happen in the world, and all the secrets of the earth. The temptation was not beauty. The temptation was omniscience. Think about that. Odysseus, The man who always needed to know things, who could not resist a cave or a question or a challenge, was about to sail past the creatures who promised to answer every question he had ever asked. Circe had warned him. "Do not listen," she said, "unless you want to die." The island of the Sirens was surrounded by a field of rotting bones, sailors who had listened and steered toward the song and never left. But Odysseus, being Odysseus, found a compromise. He told his crew to plug their ears with softened beeswax, pressing it deep so they could hear nothing. Then he had them tie him to the mast with strong ropes, and he gave them strict orders. No matter what he said, no matter how he begged, they were not to untie him until the island was well behind them. The ship sailed close. The sirens began to sing, and Odysseus heard every note. He strained against the ropes so hard they cut into his wrists. He screamed at his crew to untie him. He promised them anything. He wept. But his men, deaf to the song and following his earlier orders, only tied the knots tighter and rowed on, their oars dipping steadily through the flat, glassy water. What did the song sound like? Homer does not tell us, perhaps because any attempt to describe it would diminish it. What he tells us is that Odysseus heard the one song he could not resist, the song of everything he did not know, and he survived it only because he had been wise enough, before the moment of temptation, to take away his own ability to act on it. This is, incidentally, one of the great psychological insights in all of ancient literature. Odysseus did not resist temptation through willpower. He resisted it through preparation. He knew before the song began that he would not be strong enough to say no. He knew his own weakness as precisely as he knew his own strength. And so he designed a system, the ropes, the wax, the orders to his crew that made the right choice inevitable, regardless of how he felt in the moment. The modern world calls this a commitment device. Economists study it. Psychologists write papers about it. The basic idea is that the best time to make a good decision is before the temptation arrives, when you can still think clearly, and the best way to keep that decision is to make it physically difficult to change your mind. Odysseus invented the concept 3,000 years before anyone gave it a name. And perhaps there is something comforting in that. Even the cleverest man in Greece did not trust himself to resist a beautiful song. Even he needed ropes. The Norse told stories of the Hafru, voices in the fjords that called men into the deep. The Slavic peoples spoke of the Rusalki, drowned women who sang beneath rivers. The Maori told of the Tanifer who lured fishermen with sounds like distant flutes. Every culture that has lived near water has a story about the sea's voice, and every story agrees on one thing. The voice is beautiful, and following it means death. The sirens faded behind them, and the sea ahead was quiet, but not peaceful, because what came next was the passage every sailor feared. Scylla and Charybdis. Charybdis was a whirlpool, but calling it a whirlpool is like calling a hurricane a breeze. 3 times a day she swallowed the sea itself, drawing water and ships and anything else on the surface down into a spinning darkness, and 3 times a day she belched it all back up again. No ship that sailed over Charybdis when she inhaled survived. On the opposite side of the narrow strait sat Scylla, and Scylla was worse. She had 6 heads on 6 long necks, each head with a triple row of teeth, and she lived in a cave halfway up a cliff so sheer that no mortal could climb it. When ships passed beneath her, she would reach down with those 6 heads and pluck 6 sailors from the deck, 1 per head, and eat them alive. The men could still be seen kicking and screaming as she lifted them toward her cave, calling out for help that could not come. Circe had told Odysseus the mathematics of this passage. Sail too close to Charybdis and you lose the entire ship. Sail close to Scylla and you lose 6 men. It was the kind of choice that no one should ever have to make, and yet Odysseus made it, because the alternative was not going home at all. He steered close to Scylla. He did not tell his crew what was about to happen, because what would be the point? The 6 heads descended. 6 men were taken. Odysseus heard them screaming his name as they were lifted away, and Homer says it was the most pitiful thing he witnessed in all his years of exploring the sea. There is no trick here, no clever escape, no wordplay or hidden wine or magical herbs, just the brutal arithmetic of survival and a man who chose to sacrifice 6 so that the rest might live, and who carried the sound of their voices for the rest of his life. They sailed through. On the other side of the strait was the island of Thrinacia, where the cattle of the sun god Helios grazed. Beautiful animals, snow-white with curving horns of gold, and they never aged, never sickened, never died. They were sacred. Tiresias had warned Odysseus not to touch them. Circe had warned him not to touch them. Every source of divine wisdom available to a mortal had said the same thing. Do not eat the cows. Odysseus told his men. They promised. They swore oaths. But then the winds changed and trapped them on the island for an entire month, and their supplies ran out, and they began to starve. Odysseus went inland to pray to the gods for guidance. While he was gone, Eurylochus, his lieutenant, the same man who had warned them about Circe, convinced the crew that dying of starvation was worse than risking divine punishment. If the gods destroy us, he said, at least we will have eaten, which has a certain desperate logic to it. They slaughtered the finest of the cattle. They roasted the meat over driftwood fires. The fat sizzled, and the smoke rose into a clear sky, and on Olympus, Helios saw what they had done and was furious. He went directly to Zeus and threatened to take his son down to the Underworld and shine it among the dead instead of the living, which would have been inconvenient for everyone. Zeus promised to handle it. When Odysseus returned and smelled the roasting meat, he knew. He knew with the kind of sick certainty that comes when the thing you feared most has already happened, and there is nothing left to do but wait for the consequences. They sailed. For 6 days, nothing happened. Perhaps the men began to relax. Perhaps they even convinced themselves that the gods had not noticed or did not care. On the 7th day, Zeus sent a thunderbolt. The ship exploded. The mast snapped and crushed the helmsman. The hull cracked open. Every man was thrown into the sea, and the sea swallowed them all. Every single one of them. The men who had survived Troy, and the Cyclops, and the Laestrygonians and Scylla. All of them drowned in the cold grey water, while the wreckage of the last ship spun slowly in the current. Only Odysseus survived. He lashed together the broken mast and a piece of the keel, making a rough raft, and he clung to it as the current carried him back toward the strait. Charybdis swallowed the water beneath him, raft and all, and he caught hold of a fig tree that grew from the cliff above the whirlpool and hung there, like a bat, for hours, until the whirlpool spat his raft back out, and he dropped onto it and paddled away with his hands. A king reduced to a man clinging to driftwood, all his companions lost, exactly as the Cyclops had prayed, exactly as Tiresias had foretold. The curse had come true, and the sea, which had been trying to kill him for years, had finally taken everything except the man himself. For 9 days, Odysseus drifted, alone on the open sea, with no food, no water, no sail, no companion. Just the sun and the stars and the endless rocking of the waves. And on the 10th day, the current brought him to the most beautiful island he had ever seen. It was Ogygia, home of Calypso. Her name means the one who conceals, or the one who covers, and she was a goddess, a daughter of the Titan Atlas who held up the sky. She lived alone on an island so remote that even the other gods rarely visited. The island was a kind of paradise. Meadows of violet and wild celery spread down to white sand. 4 clear springs murmured through groves of alder, poplar, and sweet-smelling cypress. Grapevines heavy with fruit draped over the entrance to her cave, and the air was always warm, always still, always carrying the faint scent of burning cedar from the fire inside. Calypso found Odysseus washed up on her shore, half drowned and half dead, with nothing left but the body he was living in. She took him in. She nursed him back to health. She fed him ambrosia and nectar, the food of the gods, and she fell in love with him. She offered him immortality. Let that sink in. Not wealth, not power, not safe passage home. She offered him the one thing that no mortal had ever been offered. Stay with me, she said, and you will never grow old. You will never know sickness. You will never die. You will live as the gods live, in beauty and ease, forever, on an island where the weather is always perfect, and there is nothing to fear and nothing to want. Odysseus stayed for 7 years. Some accounts say he was a willing guest. Others say he was a prisoner, kept there by a goddess's desire, spending his days sitting on the rocks by the shore, staring at the horizon, weeping for a home he could not reach. Homer suggests both are true, which is probably the most honest version. He was cared for, he was comfortable, he was loved by a goddess, and he was miserable because he wanted to go home. Eventually, Athene intervened. She had never stopped caring about Odysseus, even when the other gods had. She went to Zeus and argued that it was unjust to keep a mortal man, however clever, trapped on an island against his will. Zeus agreed and sent Hermes to deliver the message. Calypso was not pleased. "You gods," she said, "you are the most jealous beings in existence. When a goddess loves a mortal man, you cannot stand it." She listed examples, Artemis with Orion, Demeter with Phaeacians. Each time the male gods had killed the mortal out of spite. But she obeyed, because even a goddess cannot argue with Zeus for long. She went to Odysseus on the beach and told him he could go. She helped him build a raft. She gave him supplies and a fair wind. And before he left, she asked him one more time, gently, whether he truly preferred Penelope to her. Odysseus, in one of his finest moments, answered with complete honesty. "Goddess," he said, "I know that Penelope cannot compare with you in beauty. She is mortal and you are divine, but it is her I want. It is home I want. And if some god wrecks me again on the wine-dark sea, I will endure it, because I have endured worse." He chose mortality over immortality. He chose the ordinary over the divine. He chose to grow old and die beside a woman he had not seen in 20 years, rather than live forever with a goddess in paradise. The ancient Greeks understood something in this moment that goes deeper than any monster or any trick. The most courageous thing Odysseus ever did was not the wooden horse, or the blinding of the Cyclops, or the journey to the land of the dead. The most courageous thing he ever did was choose to be human. And Calypso, to her credit, let him go. She could have refused. She was a goddess, and he was a mortal on her island, and there was no navy coming to rescue him. But she helped him build the raft. She showed him which trees to cut and how to fit the planks together. She gave him bread and dark, sweet wine and a bag of water. She dressed him in fresh clothes. And on the morning he sailed, she stood on the beach and watched him go. This stubborn, homesick, mortal man who had chosen wrinkles and grey hair, and eventually death over everything she had to offer. The Greeks did not make Calypso a villain. She was not wicked or jealous or vindictive. She was simply a goddess who loved a man who loved someone else, and she let him leave because keeping someone who does not want to stay is not love. It is just another kind of prison. 7 years on the most beautiful island in the world, and Odysseus spent most of them sitting on the rocks, staring at the sea, crying. There is something almost absurd about that image, and something deeply true. Paradise, it turns out, is only paradise if it contains the people you love. Without them, it is just geography. Let that settle. The way warmth returns slowly to cold hands on a winter morning. Calypso's raft was small but well built, and the wind she sent was steady and kind. For 17 days, Odysseus sailed east across open water, navigating by the stars just as Calypso had instructed, keeping the Great Bear always on his left hand. The nights were cold and the days were long, but for the first time in years, he was moving toward home under his own power, and there is a kind of peace in that, even when your vessel is a raft and your compass is a constellation. On the 18th day he saw land, mountains rising from the sea, green and dark, like the hunched back of some enormous sleeping animal. It was Scheria, the island of the Phaeacians. But Poseidon had not forgotten him. The god of the sea had been away, visiting the Ethiopians, which is the kind of detail Homer includes and never explains, as if gods having dinner plans on the far side of the world were perfectly normal. On his way back, Poseidon saw Odysseus on his little raft, within sight of land, and his anger flared. He sent a storm, a proper Mediterranean gale that turned the sky black and the sea white, and wave after wave broke over the raft until it came apart beneath him. Odysseus was thrown into the water. His clothes dragged him down. The salt strung his eyes and filled his mouth. But a sea nymph named Ino, who had once been a mortal woman herself, took pity on him. She appeared as a seabird and dropped a magical veil across his shoulders. "Take off your clothes," she said, "and swim. The veil will protect you." Odysseus, characteristically, debated whether this was a trick. Even half drowned, even with a storm tearing the sea apart around him, his first instinct was to analyze the offer. He clung to the wreckage for as long as he could, and only when the last timber broke apart did he strip off his clothes, wrap the veil around his chest, and swim. He swam for 2 days. 2 days in the open ocean, in waves taller than houses, with no food and no rest, and nothing to cling to except a piece of divine fabric, and his own refusal to die. When he finally reached the coast of Scheria, the cliffs were sheer, and the surf was smashing against the rocks with enough force to kill a man. He swam along the shore until he found the mouth of a river, and there the current was gentle, and he dragged himself out of the water onto a bed of fallen leaves beneath a pair of olive trees, one wild and one cultivated, whose branches grew so thickly together that neither wind nor rain nor sunlight could pass through them. He covered himself with leaves, the way you pull a blanket over yourself on a cold night, and he slept. Homer says the sleep that came to him was like the last ember being covered with ash, a beautiful image, because it suggests both exhaustion and preservation. The fire was not out. It was just being kept alive until morning. He was found by a princess. Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous of the Phaeacians, had come to the river with her handmaids to wash clothes. Athene had planted the idea in a dream because Athene was very good at that sort of gentle manipulation. When Odysseus emerged from the bushes, naked and caked with salt and brine, covered in scratches and looking, by his own admission, absolutely terrible, the handmaids screamed and ran. Nausicaa did not run. She stood her ground because she was young and brave, and also because Athene had quietly given her courage, and she listened as this wild, salt-crusted stranger explained that he was a traveler who had been at sea for a very long time and needed help. She gave him clothes. She told him where to find her father's palace. She treated him with the exact hospitality that the Cyclops had refused, which is not a coincidence. The Odyssey is, among other things, a long meditation on what it means to treat strangers well, and the Phaeacians are the gold standard. King Alcinous's palace was astonishing. Bronze walls, gold doors, silver doorposts, gardens that bore fruit in every season, pear and pomegranate and apple and fig and olive, and a vineyard where grapes dried in the sun while new ones ripened on the vine. There were 50 handmaids, some grinding corn on millstones, others weaving cloth, their fingers moving as fast as the leaves of a poplar tree in wind. The whole place glowed with a kind of civilized warmth that Odysseus had not experienced in years. They feasted him. They gave him a bath and fresh clothes and a place of honor at the table. And then, after dinner, the king asked him to tell his story. This is actually one of the cleverest structural decisions Homer ever made. The entire middle of the Odyssey, everything from the Cyclops to Calypso, is told as a flashback, with Odysseus narrating his own story to the Phaeacians. We have been listening to him tell it all along. Every monster, every island, every loss was recounted at a dinner table by a man who had lived through it, to people who could barely believe what they were hearing. And before Odysseus even began his tale, something happened that broke him open. The king's bard, a blind singer named Demodocus, began to play. He sang about the Trojan War. He sang about Odysseus and Achilles and the quarrel between them. And Odysseus, the man who had outwitted every creature the gods could send against him, the man who had stared down the Cyclops and resisted the Sirens and chosen mortality over immortality, this man pulled his cloak over his face and wept. He wept because he was hearing his own life turned into a song. He wept because the people he had known, the people who had died, were now characters in a story being sung by a stranger for entertainment. He wept because that is what happens to the living. They become stories. And stories, no matter how beautiful, are never quite the same as the person you actually knew. Alcinous noticed the tears. He was a perceptive man and a kind one, and he stopped the music and asked Odysseus directly, "Who are you? Where do you come from? And why does this song make you cry?" And Odysseus, for the first time since the Cyclops' island, said his real name. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes. My home is Ithaca. The room went silent. They knew the name. Everyone in the Greek world knew the name. And they listened for an entire night as he told them everything. When he was finished, the Phaeacians loaded a fast ship with gifts, bronze and gold, and finely woven cloth, and they carried Odysseus home while he slept. Homer says they laid him on the deck, wrapped in linen, and the ship was so swift and smooth that he did not wake. The Phaeacians' ships, it was said, could cross the sea faster than thought, guided not by rudder or sail, but by the minds of the sailors who knew every route. They set him down on the beach of Ithaca in the grey hour before dawn, still sleeping, and they placed his gifts beside him, and they sailed away. Poseidon, furious that they had helped the man he hated, turned their ship to stone as it entered their harbour. But that is their story, not ours. Odysseus woke on a beach. At first, he did not know where he was. A mist lay over the land, and everything looked strange and unfamiliar, and he sat among the bronze tripods and folded cloths and thought, with a sinking heart, that the Phaeacians had tricked him and set him down on some unknown shore. But Athene came to him, disguised as a young shepherd, and when Odysseus immediately began lying about who he was, spinning an elaborate fake backstory, because lying was his natural response to any uncertain situation, Athene laughed. Actually laughed. "You are impossible," she said, or words to that effect. "I am a goddess, and even I cannot outmaneuver you when it comes to deception. We are alike. You and I, both of us are clever. Both of us keep our true thoughts hidden." It is one of the warmest moments in the poem, a goddess and a mortal recognizing each other as kindred spirits. She lifted the mist, and Odysseus saw Ithaca for the first time in 20 years. The familiar harbour, the olive tree at the head of the bay, the cave where he used to play as a child. He knelt and kissed the ground. He was home, but home had changed. Athene told him what had happened while he was away. For the past 3 years, over 100 men from the surrounding islands had moved into his palace, eating his food, drinking his wine, slaughtering his cattle, and courting his wife Penelope, demanding that she choose one of them as her new husband. They assumed Odysseus was dead. Most people did, after 20 years. Telemachus, his son, was now a young man of 20, and he had been living in a house full of men who treated him with open contempt, eating his inheritance, threatening his life, and pressuring his mother every day. The boy had grown up without a father, and his entire experience of manhood so far had been watching strangers take everything his family owned. Athene disguised Odysseus as an old beggar, bent and ragged, so he could enter his own house without being recognized. She told him to go first to the hut of Eumaeus, the swineherd, the one servant who had remained loyal. What follows is the most human, most tender, most quietly devastating section of the Odyssey. and it happens without any monsters or gods or magic at all. Eumaeus did not recognize his master, of course. He saw only an old beggar at his door, but he invited him in, fed him, gave him a place by the fire, and apologized that he could not offer more. "I would give you better hospitality," he said, "but the young lords in the master's house have taken everything." He spoke about Odysseus with such love and grief that Odysseus, sitting 3 feet away in disguise, had to fight to keep his face still. Telemachus came to the hut the next morning, sent there by Athene, and Eumaeus went to tell Penelope that her son had returned safely from a journey. When they were alone, Athene restored Odysseus to his true appearance. Taller, broader, his hair darkened, his rags replaced by clean robes. Telemachus stared. "You must be a god," he said. "No," said Odysseus, "I am your father." Telemachus could not believe it. He had been waiting 20 years for this moment, and now that it was here, it did not feel real. "No man could change like that," he said. "No mortal could look old one moment and young the next." "Athene did this," Odysseus said. "It is easy for the gods, but I am your father. I am the one you have been waiting for." And Telemachus, who had been strong and careful and controlled for his entire young life, who had endured the suitors and the loneliness and the doubt without breaking, fell against his father's chest and wept. And Odysseus held his son and wept too. Homer says they cried like eagles whose nestlings have been taken, a strange and beautiful comparison, the fierceness of the bird mixed with the helplessness of loss. They wept for a long time, and there was no shame in it. Now, I want to tell you about a dog. When Odysseus finally approached his own palace, still disguised as a beggar, leaning on a stick and wearing rags, he passed through the courtyard where the suitors' horses were tied, and the servants went about their work. And there, lying on a heap of dung outside the gate, covered in ticks, too old and too weak to stand, was a dog named Argos. Argos had been Odysseus's hunting dog. 20 years ago, when Odysseus had left for Troy, Argos had been young and fast and beautiful, the finest hound on the island. Odysseus had raised him from a pup. They had hunted together through the hills of Ithaca, chasing wild goats and hares, and the dog had been the pride of the household. But that was 20 years ago. Now Argos was ancient. The servants had neglected him after Odysseus left, because without the master, who would care for the master's dog? He lay on the dung heap, too weak to move, eaten by fleas, abandoned by everyone. But when Odysseus walked past, Argos raised his head. His ears went up. His tail wagged just once, just a little, thumping weakly against the ground. He did not have the strength to stand or walk to his master, but he recognized him. After 20 years, through the disguise and the rags and the years of aging, the dog knew. Odysseus saw him, and he looked away quickly, because if he stopped, if he knelt beside the dog, if he showed any sign of recognition, the suitors might notice. He brushed a tear from his face, and he kept walking. Argos laid his head back down, and he died. He had been waiting 20 years. He had held on through neglect and old age and the slow failure of his body for this one moment, to see his master come home, and once he had seen it, he could let go. Homer tells this story in 12 lines, 12 lines out of 12,000. And those 12 lines have made more people cry than any other passage in Western literature, because the dog asks for nothing. He does not need to be recognized. He does not need a reward. He just needed to know that the person he loved was alive and had come back, and then he could rest. Let that image stay with you for a while. There is nothing more to say about it. Inside the palace, Odysseus found exactly what Athene had described. The great hall was full of young men, over 100 of them, eating his food, drinking his wine, ordering his servants around, and competing for the attention of his wife. They had been at this for 3 years. They slaughtered his best livestock every day for their feasts. They forced his maidservants to serve them. They plotted to kill Telemachus. Penelope was upstairs, and she was, it is fair to say, the other hero of this story. For 3 years, she had been holding the suitors at bay with a trick worthy of Odysseus himself. She had told them she would choose a husband once she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's father, Laertes. It was a reasonable excuse. Every day she sat at her loom and wove, and the suitors watched the fabric grow, and they waited. And every night by lamplight, she unraveled what she had woven during the day. For 3 years, 3 years of weaving and unraveling, of building and undoing, of smiling at men she despised, while secretly working against them every single night. It is the most elegant deception in the Odyssey, and it was not invented by Odysseus. It was invented by his wife. Eventually, one of the maidservants betrayed her, and the suitors caught her unraveling the shroud in the dark. After that, she had no more tricks. The pressure to choose a husband became unbearable. She was running out of time. And then, on the day Odysseus returned in disguise, Penelope announced a contest. She brought out Odysseus's great bow, a bow so stiff and powerful that no ordinary man could string it, and she set up 12 axes in a row, each with a ring at the top of the handle. Whoever could string the bow and shoot an arrow through all 12 rings in a single shot would win her hand. Now, whether Penelope knew or suspected or simply hoped is one of the great unanswered questions of the Odyssey. Did she set the contest knowing that only Odysseus could pass it? Did she recognize the beggar? Homer never quite says. What he gives us is a woman who, after 20 years of waiting, chose this particular day to set this particular test, involving this particular weapon that only one man in the world could use. You can draw your own conclusions. The suitors tried the bow one by one. They could not even string it. These were strong men, warriors and nobles, and they strained and sweated and cursed, but the bow might as well have been made of iron. They rubbed it with tallow to make it more supple. They warmed it by the fire. Nothing worked. The bow simply refused to bend for anyone who was not its owner. Then the old beggar asked for a turn. The suitors laughed. Some were angry. But Telemachus, who knew the truth, insisted, and the bow was placed in the beggar's hands. Odysseus turned it over. He examined it the way a musician examines an instrument he has not played in years, checking the curve, testing the string, feeling the weight and balance. He found no worm damage. The wood was still sound. And then, without apparent effort, he strung it. The string hummed when he plucked it, a clear, pure note, like a swallow's cry. The suitors went pale. Odysseus notched an arrow. He drew the string back to his ear. He aimed down the line of 12 axes and released. The arrow flew through every ring without touching a single one. And then he turned to the suitors. What followed was not a trick, and it was not a negotiation. It was a reckoning. Odysseus dropped his disguise. He stood at the threshold of his own hall, the great bow in his hands, and Telemachus beside him with a sword, and together, father and son, they fought. The details of the fight are for another telling. What matters is that when it was over, the great hall was quiet, and the men who had consumed his home and tormented his family were gone, and Odysseus stood in the middle of his own house for the first time in 20 years, breathing hard, covered in dust, finally home. But Penelope did not run to him. The servants told her, "Your husband is here. He has come home. He has killed the suitors." And Penelope came downstairs and sat in a chair by the fire and looked at the man standing in her hall, and she did not move. She did not speak. Telemachus was frustrated. "Mother," he said, "why do you sit apart? Why do you not go to him? No other woman would keep such distance from a husband who had been gone for 20 years. And Penelope said, "If it is truly Odysseus, he and I have ways of knowing each other that no one else can share." She was being careful. 20 years of tricks and lies and false hopes had taught her caution. She had been fooled before. She had been lied to before. She would not throw herself into the arms of a stranger, no matter how much she wanted to believe. Odysseus understood. He smiled. "Let her test me," he said. "She will know me in time." He bathed. He put on clean clothes. Athene made him look taller and handsomer. He came back to the hall and sat across from his wife, and still she did not yield. And then she set her trap. "Eurycleia," she said to the old nurse, in a voice loud enough for Odysseus to hear, "Move the bed out of our bedroom and make it up for him in the hall." Odysseus's reaction was instant and unguarded. "Who has moved my bed?" he said, and there was real anger in his voice. "That bed cannot be moved. I built it myself. I built it around a living olive tree. The trunk of the tree is one of the bedposts. The bed is rooted in the ground. No man could move it unless he cut the tree down." And with those words, Penelope knew. Because only Odysseus knew about the olive tree. It was the secret of their marriage, the one detail that no spy or impostor could possibly have known. He had built their bedroom around a living tree, literally rooted their marriage in the earth, and the bed had never been moved because it could not be moved, because some things, the real things, the things that matter, are permanent. Penelope's knees went weak. She ran to him. She threw her arms around his neck and wept, and Odysseus held her and wept too, and Homer says it was like the moment when shipwrecked sailors finally see land, when they have been swimming for so long they thought they would never stop. And then there it is, solid ground, and they drag themselves onto the beach and feel the earth beneath them, and know they are going to live. He compares the wife's relief to the sailor's relief, which is exactly right, because Penelope had been at sea too. She had been lost too. She had been surviving day after day in a house full of strangers, holding on to the hope that the person she loved was still alive somewhere on the water, still trying to come home. They went to their bed, the bed with the olive tree at its heart, and they told each other everything. All the years, all the stories, all the grief and cleverness and patience and refusal to give up. Athene held back the dawn, Homer says, to give them a longer night. Because some conversations need more darkness than the world usually provides. And that is the Odyssey. Not the monsters, not the gods, not the tricks. A man who wanted to go home. A woman who refused to stop waiting. A dog who held on for one last look. And a bed that could not be moved because it was built around something alive. The story has survived for nearly 3,000 years. It has been translated into every language. It has been retold by poets and playwrights and novelists and filmmakers, each finding something new in it, because the story is big enough to hold whatever you bring to it. If you come to it looking for adventure, you will find adventure. If you come to it looking for wisdom, it is there. If you come to it late at night, tired and far from the people you love, you will find a story that understands exactly how that feels. The Greeks told it around fires, in the great halls of kings, and in the small houses of ordinary families, on winter nights when the wind blew off the sea, and the flames sent shadows dancing on the walls. They told it because it was exciting, yes, and because it was beautiful, but also because it answered a question that every human being asks at some point in their life. What is worth going home to? Not immortality, not glory, not the song of the Sirens or the peace of the Lotus eaters or the comfort of a goddess's island. What is worth going home to is the specific, imperfect, mortal life you have chosen, the particular person sleeping in the bed you built, the old dog in the yard who still remembers your voice, the rocky little island that nobody else would want. That is what Odysseus chose, and that is why the story survives. The fire is low now. The wine-dark sea is calm. The stars are turning slowly overhead, the same stars that Odysseus navigated by, the same stars that people have watched from beds and beaches and ships' decks for as long as there have been people to watch them. The Great Bear is there, and Orion, and the Pleiades, just as they were 3,000 years ago, just as they will be long after we are gone. Ithaca is quiet. The olive tree grows in the bedroom as it always has, its roots deep in the island stone, its branches reaching upward through the roof and into the night air. The bed is there. Penelope is there. The long journey is over. And the man who saw everything, who survived everything, who lost everything and chose to come home anyway, is sleeping at last. There is one more thing worth knowing, because the Greeks could never quite leave a story alone. After the reunion, after the bed and the olive tree and the long night of telling stories, Odysseus went to see his father. Laertes had been a king once, a proud man, a strong man. But the years of waiting had broken him in a different way than they had broken Penelope. Where Penelope had hardened, had become sharper and more watchful, Laertes had softened. He had retreated to a small farm in the hills above the palace, where he tended his orchard alone, wearing old clothes, sleeping on a bed of leaves in winter and a cot by the vineyard in summer. He had stopped eating properly. He had stopped caring about his appearance. He had aged the way people age when they have stopped believing that anything good will happen. Odysseus found him digging around the base of a pear tree, his hands cracked and dirty, an old leather cap on his head to keep the sun off. And even though Odysseus had practiced what he would say, even though he had planned to test his father the way Penelope had tested him, when he actually saw the old man, bent and thin and working alone in the dirt, all the cleverness went out of him. He told Laertes who he was. Laertes did not believe it. "Prove it," the old man said, and there was a wildness in his eyes that was half hope and half terror, because hoping and being wrong again would have destroyed him. Odysseus pointed to the trees. "You gave me 13 pear trees," he said, "and 10 apple trees, and 40 fig trees, and you told me which row of vines was mine." He named them all, the gifts his father had given him as a boy, walking through this same orchard decades ago, a father teaching a son which trees belonged to him. Laertes' knees gave way. He reached for his son, and Odysseus caught him, and they stood there in the orchard, the old man and the wanderer, holding each other among the pear trees, and the world was small and quiet and complete. That is the last image, not the great hall, not the bow, not the battle. An old man in a garden holding his son, surrounded by the trees he planted when the world was young and everything was still ahead of them. The sea is gentle now. Somewhere beyond the window, beyond whatever room you are lying in, the same stars are turning that Odysseus saw. The same moon is moving through the same sky. The world is very old, and the stories it tells about itself are very old. And some of those stories are so true that they never stop being true, no matter how many centuries pass. You do not need to sail anywhere tonight. You do not need to outwit anyone or endure anything or prove that you are brave. You are already home. You are already in the place where the people who love you know your name. The journey, for now, is finished. The olive tree grows in the dark. The dog is sleeping. The weaving is done. And somewhere on a rocky island in a sea that exists only in stories now, an old soldier is lying beside his wife, in a bed that cannot be moved, listening to her breathe, and knowing that everything, all the years, all the monsters, all the salt and storm and sorrow, was worth it for this. Close your eyes. Rest now. The story is told.